So let's go ahead and start this class with the prayers that we've been doing. Let me get those on the screen. And we'll begin with the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha and just do this one time, thinking about the qualities of the Buddha that we ourselves are trying to achieve and admiring the Buddha, seeking the support of the Buddha as well as the three jewels to be able to accomplish this ourselves. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And then we'll do the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then Refuge in Bodhicitta, first time in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi dola penshir sangye druparshu Sangye chodang soki choknam la Jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chanyan gipe sanam gi dola penshir sangye duparsho. Good, let's do a short meditation before we begin. Spend the first few minutes focusing on the breath to calm the mind, to let go of whatever distractions we might have. And then I'll come in and lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for tonight's teaching. So now let's set our motivation for tonight's class. And I thought we would do this by meditating on verse 27 that we covered last week. That was also a part of the first of the 10 presentations on nature. So verse 27 says, because the activities of the Dharmakaya are pervasive, because suchness is undifferentiable, and because of having the lineage, all sentient beings always have the Buddha essence. So the first line speaks to the fact that the Dharmakaya, the minds of the Buddhas, are the perfect transmitters of the Dharma. They have no other purpose than to bring the Dharma to the minds of all beings. On the other hand, the minds of beings, our own minds, are the perfect receivers of those teachings. Every single being has engaged in some measure of virtue, achieved a good rebirth, had positive qualities. This is due to the influence, the activities of the Dharmakaya. So our minds are these perfect receivers of the Dharma of the Buddhas, which is intended to help us to achieve both temporary and ultimate well-being. Secondly, the nature of our minds and the nature of the Buddha's minds, these natures are completely undifferentiable. Our minds are empty of inherent existence. The minds of the Buddhas are empty of inherent existence. And as we've seen previously, it's due to emptiness that the mind then can transform and change. If our minds were inherently existent, we could never remove these adventitious stains. So the emptiness of our own minds and the minds of the Buddhas, completely the same, undifferentiable, both lacking inherent existence. And then lastly, this third line speaks to the developmental lineage, that aspect of our minds that has the power, the energy to be able to transform into the mind of a Buddha through practicing, especially the Mahayana teachings, completely removing all of the obscurations in the mind, all the stains, and completely developing all the positive qualities. And Maitreya concludes saying, because of these three reasons, because of these three things that exist in the nature of our experience, our own minds, we all have the Buddha essence. Ourselves and each and every sentient being has that Tathagata essence, the essence that will develop eventually into the state of Buddhahood. So as we set our motivation, we can reflect on, again, first the fact that we ourselves can attain that. Without a doubt, we have Buddha essence, Buddha nature. Because of these reasons. And therefore, we can set that motivation of becoming a Buddha, but not for ourselves alone, but for the sake of all beings who also possess Buddha essence, who also can transform their minds into that state. So in this way, we generate bodhicitta motivation, this dual aspiration, the aspiration to bring all sentient beings to the fulfillment of their potential, to having become a Buddha ourselves. And this is why we are here tonight, engaging in this teaching. Okay, good. So welcome again. This is our 7th class in this series on Tathagata essence, or Tathagata essence, however it's pronounced. What I wanted to do to get us back into the material is last week we introduced these 10 presentations that are the immediate topic right after that verse and I think one or two verses after, but it essentially is kind of introducing us to Buddha nature by way of these 10 presentations. And the first presentation had to do with nature. And so I wanted to kind of review that by using some of the slides that unfortunately I didn't get a chance to present last week. And then we'll see if there are any questions on that before we continue to the second topic. So, whoops, this isn't what I wanted to share. Sorry. I wanted to share the slides. There it is, PowerPoint. Okay. So again, some of these slides were in the PDF file that I provided for last week. It's going to be in this week's as well, but just know that I didn't get to these last week because we were in the midst of that topic and I just didn't get the opportunity to go back to the slides. I want to share at times from this book that, again, you can find out there from Geshe Acharya Thupten Lodin, who was a monk who lived in Australia, passed away some years ago. It's a wonderful book to cover the main topic that we're looking at here in terms of these 10 presentations and then what are called the 9 similes that I mentioned last week as well that we'll get into. So Geshe Lodin says, the nature, this first presentation, refers to 3 things, and it's the same things that we just meditated on. The truth body, the Dharmakaya, which again pervades all beings. 2, suchness, the suchness of our own minds and the Buddha's minds being undifferentiable. And 3, Buddha potential, the developmental potential that we all have that can transform into the mind of a Buddha. These 3 are included in the category of nature as distinct from the categories of cause and result, which are the second and third presentations. We'll get into the second one, cause, this evening. They are illustrated by 3 analogies. We looked at these last week. The Tathagata's truth body, the Dharmakaya, is likened to a wish-fulfilling jewel. It has the same qualities. It fulfills the wishes of all beings by bringing them the Dharma, by bringing them, pervading their experience with the teachings of the Dharma so that they can benefit from that. They can engage in virtue to attain higher rebirths. They can engage in the ultimate virtue, which will allow them to attain definite goodness, liberation, and enlightenment. Number 2, suchness is likened to space. You know, space is a permanent, unchanging phenomenon. It is a negation. Space, here we don't mean the physical space we're looking at, we mean the conceptual construct that is the absence of obstructive contact. So that idea of an absence of something, a negation of something, is similar to suchness or emptiness. And that's often used as an example to help get our minds around the concept of a negation. That's referring again to our naturally abiding Buddha lineage, the fact that we have this emptiness of our own minds that is identical to the emptiness of a Buddha's mind. The only difference is that there's also in the Buddha's mind the removal, the negation of all of the adventitious stains that we are currently plagued with. So again, the suchness itself, the emptiness itself, is identical, undifferentiable. Number 3, Buddha potential, and here we do mean primarily the developmental potential, is likened to water. Just as water will moisten the mind and moisten the ground and allow things to grow, so too our Buddha potential has that ability to give that power and energy to our development of our minds, the development of all of the qualities, the wisdom, the compassion, and so on, that will lead to Buddhahood. So we looked at these last week. These 3, truth body, suchness, and Buddha potential, are by nature themselves ever pure or undefiled, and that they have always had a nature of emptiness of inherent existence. So whether we're talking about the Dharmakaya that has its own emptiness, the suchness, emptiness itself that is also empty of inherent existence, or Buddha potential, the minds that we have that will develop into the state of Buddhahood, they all have had that nature of emptiness of inherent existence from the beginning. Nothing has ever had any inherent existence. And then like that, to use this analogy of those 3 objects that they were being compared to, a jewel is not by nature hidden by a covering of earth. It's only there adventitiously, right? 2, space is not by nature obscured by clouds. And 3, water is not by nature polluted by mud. So again, these are ways that we could look at those 3 analogies and say they have a similarity in terms of their a conventional nature that is identical to the ultimate nature of all three of these. So again, nature was a very brief presentation. We looked at it, began on page 95 of our commentary with the 2 lines that introduced it, and then was like only 1 page, page 96, that we went through of our text. So what I'd like to do to get us started, well, let me see if there are questions, and then we'll come back to this, and I'll introduce you to the second presentation. Any questions from last week or on this topic, now that you've had a week to maybe digest some of what we looked at? Any questions? Okay, then let's move forward. So as I said, I would like to introduce this topic of cause. The next 2 are cause and result. In other words, the causes that bring about the purification of the mind, that allow you to attain the Dharmakaya, and then the resultant Dharmakaya state in terms of looking at it from a vantage point of the various sort of perfections within it, not the usual perfections that we talk about, the paramitas, but rather another way of observing that. So what I'm going to do is go through the commentary from Geshe Loden on this first, and then we'll go through the chart, and then we'll go through the text. That way we've got kind of 3 different ways of approaching this material and get our heads around it. So as he says on the slide there, it says, in this case, causes refers to 4 particular causes which purify the obstructions to realizing this threefold nature that we just spoke of. That the threefold nature is going to be a term that you'll see occasionally referring to the first presentation, the Dharmakaya, suchness, and the Buddha potential. These causes enable the threefold nature to emerge by purifying the obstacles to it. So there are a set of 4 causes that deal with 4 different obstacles. So these are the 4 that are being set out as the causes in this presentation, and they have an analogy themselves. Maitreya likes to use these analogies, and again, it's one of the richnesses of this text, I find, is that these beautiful ways of talking about things that are very poetic. First is faith in the Mahayana Dharma. It is being likened to a seed. And seed here, I mean, the commentaries that I've looked at are kind of, the whole analogy has to do with like a being being born. Remember, we use this term, Tathagata Garbha. Garbha is the Sanskrit for kind of womb. And the idea is that the Buddha will be born out of all of what we're discussing, Buddha nature, Buddha potential. So the idea here is that this is like the seed of the Father that is involved in the whole process of a human being born. Number 2 is a bodhisattva's higher wisdom cognizing emptiness is like a mother. That's the mother in whom all of this whole process will develop. Without the mother of wisdom, we often talk about the Prajnaparamita being the mother of all of the resultant states of attainment in the Buddhist path. This perfection of wisdom is always referred to as the mother. So the higher wisdom that is cognizing emptiness is like that, playing that role of a mother. Whereas again, the Father is supplying the seed that will allow that process to go forward. They don't use the egg in here, and I'm assuming the egg is kind of Buddha nature. But let's take a look at what else is on the list here. Number 3 is a bodhisattva's higher concentration. Of course, we recall that we need to have this very stable foundation of concentration, this samadhi, meditative stabilization. It is being compared to being secure in the comfort of a mother's womb. So you have the mother that is emptiness, the wisdom realizing emptiness, and the womb within it, a sort of stable place in which one can abide through gestation, is this concentrative state. Number 4 is a bodhisattva's great compassion. And it's likened to a nurse who tends to the mother during pregnancy, but moreover, tends to the child and allows the child to grow and develop into the fullness of a being who can help others and so on. So great compassion is included on the list. I spoke about great compassion previously. It's not simply the compassionate wish that others not suffer. It's the sincere desire to take responsibility for helping that to happen, saying it is my responsibility to free others from suffering and so on. Okay, so let's take a look then, before we go on to the chart. See, I'll get the chart up here and we'll have a little more information from the chart as to what we are going to be dealing with tonight. And then we'll go to the actual text. Remember, this is that set of charts that comes from Institute de Lama Tsongkhapa, ILTK, where I studied in the master's program and where this was taught by Geshe Tenzin Temple. And so these are materials that were produced there, and they're really quite useful. Recall that we've got kind of 5 columns here. The first one is always just introducing what we mean by that particular, which of the particular presentations we are dealing with. In this case, it's again number 2, cause, which, as we saw in the slides, this is the causes for being able to develop our Buddha nature into the state of the Dharmakaya. Okay? So let's take a look all the way to the far right first. We have here what I like to refer to as kind of the purpose in this presentation. So on the far right, it says here, the 4 causes are what purify the lineage of the 4 obstacles that hinder the transformation of Buddha potential into a fully enlightened Buddha. Kind of like the main 4 things that are blocking you from moving and progressing towards Buddhahood. They need to have 4 causes that act as antidotes to those, that opposing forces to those. The fact that the mind is by nature pure and that the stains are adventitious is shown by the fact that there are causes that are capable of separating the mind from those stains. So again, I mentioned last week how the 10 presentations, their primary purpose is the first thing, to show that by nature the mind is pure, to allow us to gain an appreciation for the clear light nature of the mind. The 9 similes, their main purpose is to show that the stains are adventitious. You can't talk about one without talking about the other because they're very much correlated. So in many of these presentations, we will see both topics being part of it. Nonetheless, we're mostly trying to get confidence in the fact that our minds are fundamentally clear and pure, not just conventionally, which is their conventional nature, but ultimately because they don't exist inherently. And therefore, the stains, of course, don't exist inherently, and they can be removed. So these, again, are very correlated topics. So let's take a look at those 4 causes that, again, we saw in that presentation by Geshe Loden. This is in the second column. The 4 causes that purify the lineage and the analogies that illustrate their functions are as follows. Faith in the Mahayana Dharma, like a seed, here a seed of an emperor, a Buddha, kind of, emperor. We often use even the term like a wheel-turning king, these beings who have these great powers to be able to have a huge beneficial impact on the world and so on. But the idea here is like this is the seed that is introduced into the process. Then we have, of course, the wisdom realizing emptiness, which is like a mother. Then we have the samadhi, the concentration, which is like the womb of the mother, as I said, kind of protecting and being a stable ground in which development can occur. And then we have finally great compassion, which is like a nurse, being someone who can, again, tend to the process to make sure that the resultant state is achieved. In the third column there, we have the 4 obstacles that are purified by the 4 causes. So these are lined up respectively. So number 1, hatred towards the Mahayana Dharma or some sort of neglect of the Mahayana Dharma is counteracted by faith in the Mahayana Dharma, right? Because if we have faith in the Mahayana Dharma, then we will stop denigrating the Mahayana Dharma. So we're going to see when we talk about column 4 there, those beings who might be in that category of denigrating the Mahayana Dharma. Number 2, views of the self. Having a view of the self, meaning some sort of fabrication around the I or the identity of things, whether it be the self of persons or self of phenomena. Those views are counteracted, of course, by number 2 in the second column, the causes. The wisdom realizing emptiness, which counteracts all false views of a self. Then we have number 3, fear of cyclic existence. So fear of cyclic existence is something that we do need to generate as part of our path. But if we fall into the extreme of just being concerned about our own cyclic existence, our own samsara, then we won't go on to benefit others. So why number three there is concentration or samadhi, why that is being lined up with fear of cyclic existence is that actually when you do have these high states of concentration and meditative stabilization, it protects the mind from suffering to a great degree. Why? Because the delusions don't arise. They've been suppressed through the process of deepening our concentration. This is one of the benefits of developing very stable, like shine and above, calm abiding and above, is that it diminishes the power of the afflictions so that they don't arise so easily. Because you calm the mind to some degree by suppressing those afflictions. You cannot be free of them solely through concentration. Remember the Buddha, as Prince Siddhartha, when he studied after he left the palace, he was with these great meditation masters, and they gave him these amazing techniques to get to these very, very deep, subtle states of mind. But he never got liberated. There's never any moksha through pure concentration. But it's a very safe container to be in because it protects you, just like the womb of the mother protects the infant so that it can develop and grow. And then number four, no concern for sentient beings is an obstacle. If we're kind of in our own little self-cherishing world and not thinking of others, cherishing them, then we will not be able to, of course, to achieve Buddhahood either. So this, of course, is counteracted by great compassion, which again is exemplified as a nurse. I'm going to talk about column 3 a little bit later because when we get into the actual presentation in the text of those, I think it'll be easier because you'll see there's obviously a lot more words in column 3, but that's actually looking at the persons who possess those various obstacles. And once we go into that in the text, I think it'll be a little bit easier to go through it there. So now let's go through the text and let's just go back to page 95 of the text, which was again where this was, the second presentation was introduced in verse 30 CD, again, the last two lines of verse 30. It arises through devotion to the Dharma, again, faith in the Mahayana Dharma, supreme wisdom, that exalted wisdom of emptiness, samadhi or meditative stabilization, and great compassion. It just says compassion here, but that's shorthand for great compassion. Whenever in this text, it seems most of the times when we talk about compassion, we're talking about great compassion. I think that was mentioned in one of the previous classes. So once more, I'll just read this very briefly. From great devotion for the Mahayana, which can be compared to a seed, a mother, a womb, and a nurse. So that again is referring to the respective three remaining ones as well. Great devotion for the Mahayana is like a seed, higher wisdom like a mother, epitomized by the perfection of wisdom in the mind stream of the Bodhisattva. And then from the limitless gateways of the Bodhisattva's meditative concentration, that's compared to the womb. And then fourthly, from great compassion, which is compared to the nurse. Suchness will be rid of all defilement. The lineage will be purified. And from this process of transformation, the Dharmakaya will arise. It's kind of interesting. All three of those aspects of nature are mentioned there, right? Suchness will be rid of all defilement. Suchness with stains will become suchness without stains. Again, undifferentiable. The lineage, the Buddha lineage or potential that we have will be purified. That's a developmental lineage. And then the Dharmakaya will arise. So it's not just, again, the outside activities of the Dharmakaya that we're talking about with that first aspect of nature, but also the Dharmakaya we have within our own continuum when our minds fully develop into that state. All right? So again, we're going to go forward then to page 97, where the actual presentation on cause occurs. So it says the meaning of cause. This is under headings of question and answer. The commentary asks, what does this verse teach? The answer is under two headings. There's a general explanation and then a specific explanation on the nature of the causes that are antidotes to the obstructions. Those four obstacles or obstructions. Okay, so we have a root verse, and the root text is going to be talking about first the kinds of persons with the obstructions and the obstructions themselves. So then we're going to look at the antidotal causes. Okay, so in terms of these, verse 32, the first 4 lines, because there are actually 6 lines to verse 32, says animosity towards the Mahayana Dharma. That was again on our list of the 4 obstacles. 2, a view of the self. 3, fear of the sufferings of samsara. And 4, lack of concern for the welfare of sentient beings. are the four obstructions. These are the four main things that Maitreya is saying get in the way of our being able to develop our minds into the Dharmakaya. And these are respectively of those of great desire, the Tritikas as they're called, these outsiders, foreigners, non-Buddhists, hearers. We've talked about hearers before. They are the Shravakas who follow the path of the fundamental vehicle, seeking their own liberation. And then what are called here the self-arisen. And if you go down to the note 67, you'll see that that's referring to the solitary realizers. They're called self-arisen again because a solitary realizer makes that strong aspiration to achieve their own nirvana, their own liberation in their final lifetime in a place where no Buddhas exist, no teachers exist, so they can kind of achieve it in a self-arisen manner. Okay, so those of strong attachment who harbor hatred and anger toward the Mahayana Dharma, the outsider Tirthankara who have views of this on the self of persons, the hearers who focus solely on their own welfare are fearful of the sufferings of samsara and wish to abandon others. And number four, those self-arisen ones, again, solitary realizers who pay no regard to the welfare of others or to the thought, I will free sentient beings from suffering. These are the four obstructions to the attainment of omniscience. It's kind of interesting. They divide the hearers and solitary realizers into two different sort of faults, but they both have kind of similar faults, if you ask me, again, because they both are simply trying to achieve their own liberation. So they are doing it primarily out of a fear of samsara and don't have the mind that cherishes others where their compassion, because they do have immeasurable compassion that includes all beings, but it doesn't become great compassion. So let's continue here. It says here, these are four separate divisions made on the basis of the type of person. However, all those who would travel the Mahayana path must abandon these four, regardless of whether we fit neatly into one category or another. And on the basis of the threefold division of the extreme of samsara, the extreme of peace, and thirdly, the absence of these two extremes, the above can be understood as material for ascertaining the path that accomplishes the final state of non-abiding nirvana. So let me talk a little bit about these before we go on. Because I think it is important to identify these two extremes. Sometimes we use different identification of what we mean by two extremes. Like when we talk about the extreme views, those are the views of permanence and kind of existence or eternalism. I'm sorry, that's kind of the one, permanence, existence, eternalism. And the second one is a nihilistic view of kind of annihilation, disintegration, that sort of thing. That's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking about the two extremes in terms of results, or things that you're trying to avoid. You want to avoid samsara, so this is one extreme, and of course the bodhisattvas want to avoid samsara as well, right? Who wants to be in samsara in terms of continuing to be under the control of karma and delusion? Secondly, there's the extreme, though, of nirvana, and by nirvana there, we don't mean nirvana in a real general sense. We mean a specific nirvana, which is, again, the self-liberation that is the goal of the fundamental vehicle, where individuals want to be extricated from samsara themselves and abide in solitary peace, removed from the suffering of the world. For the bodhisattva, those two extremes are both the enemy, right? For the hearers and the solitary realizers, they want to be free of samsara and they move to the extreme of nirvana. There are some people, again, we're going to see that are still firmly stuck in the extreme of samsara, where they are not willing or able to get out to the extreme of nirvana even. But for the bodhisattva, both extremes are a trap. If you end up in the extreme of samsara, of course, you continue to be in cyclic existence and you can't help other beings, right? This is the one thing when we generate bodhicitta, we're always trying to become a Buddha for the sake of others. The only way we're going to be able to help others to the greatest degree is by becoming fully enlightened. I sometimes use the example of quicksand. I've never seen quicksand in person. I've only got those visions of it from like 1960s TV shows or something. But you know, you could never help someone in quicksand if you're in the quicksand yourself, right? How would you get them out of it when you're not on any sort of stable ground that's transcended the quicksand, above and beyond the quicksand? So there too, you have to be outside of samsara in order to benefit others. But the second one, the extreme of nirvana, is the fault that if you get solely focused on your own liberation, then you're going to abide in this state of peace for who knows how long. And they say it's quite a long time. You enter the fundamental vehicle path, you achieve your liberation, you die out of the body that you achieve that in and leave that body behind. You have what's called a nirvana without remainder, and you go into that state of peace. They say you even have a form of like a mental body at that point. And you're just hanging out in this kind of state of peace because you created the karma for that result. And that's been your aspiration, is only to achieve your own liberation. And then eventually it said a Buddha wakes you out of that and how it causes you to enter the path again. I spoke about this previously. So again, this is a fault. This is not somewhere the Bodhisattva wants to end up because they can't help beings from that place either. What they want is a non-abiding nirvana, free of the two extremes. That's what we mean by the term non-abiding. They're not abiding in samsara. They're not abiding in the extreme of nirvana. Again, a self-liberation, a state where you're in that peace by yourself. So let me go ahead now and introduce this, the rest of this chart. I think it would be useful to go through it before we continue on. And we go through that column. The persons who possess these obstacles. So the first one is called those with attachment to samsara, to existence, having a desirous mind to continue to be in this state. So this is kind of the sum total of those who are falling into the extreme of, well, actually, this would include some beyond that. Let's go through it because you have to kind of go through this presentation and then go through the text in order to line these all up accordingly with correct things. But this is actually the first one, those who have some hatred towards the Mahayana Dharma, that first fault. Those with attachment to cyclic existence are described as first. Non-Buddhists, what are again called Tirthikas or Forders, with no belief in nirvana. They don't really have the teachings that support that. They don't have any generation of the mind that strives to attain it. So they will continue to be in samsara. Secondly, would be Buddhists who maintain that the Mahayana is not the teaching of the Buddha and reject it. These two fall into the extreme of samsara due to attachment to it. So they can be included within that first category of having an extreme, falling into the extreme of samsara, but they are essentially all those who have the first fault, the first obstacle, which is hatred towards the Mahayana Dharma. Again, and particularly the second ones. I mean, the first ones, you might not say they have hatred necessarily. They're non-Buddhists who don't believe in nirvana. Maybe they don't specifically even think about the Mahayana Dharma. But nonetheless, they don't really have a path and they are stuck within samsara and they keep going from life to life because they've never come across the teachings that will help them to attain any sort of nirvana, much less non-abiding nirvana. The second one, of course, are those who have some disdain for the Mahayana, which we do know from history that there was a period of time where some in the Buddhist path felt that the Mahayana teachings were not the teachings of the Buddha. They were not respected in the same vein as the Pali Canon and so on. Secondly, are those engaged in wrong methods through desiring peace. We're going to see these categories come in later. Again, this is just a way of setting out kind of three different categories that have to do with different types of beings. Here we include the Tirthikas who believe in a permanent self of persons. There are those on the that are non-Buddhist who actually hold to something that we call in the traditional teachings is called Atman. The Atman is a sort of soul or permanent self who they are essentially holding on to a view of self. So this is again that second fault, that second obstacle that's mentioned in the third column, views of the self. We have these distorted views of the self. It's impossible to attain nirvana. You end up still being stuck within samsara, even though you're clinging to or desiring to attain an extreme of nirvana. Again, that's going to be talked about a little bit differently here in terms of what that means. We'll get to that in a moment. But number two on the list, again, within this second, those engaged in wrong methods through desiring peace. The second item says Buddhist sects who assert a self-sufficient, substantially existent self of persons. This is a real kind of specific sect of early Buddhists called the Vatsiputriyanas, Putriyans. These Vatsiputriyana was a branch of the Vaibhashika, the very lowest of the four tenet systems. And these were beings who didn't assert the emptiness of this second type of self, a substantially a self-sufficient, substantially existent self of person. Let me take it off screen for a moment to talk about these two. The first one was a permanent kind of unitary self that is, again, this Atman or soul that many of these traditions hold to. And Buddhism denies that across the board. There are no Buddhist sects that don't deny that level of self that is being propounded by these other traditions. In fact, they do say that that is kind of an acquired concept. We aren't born with the concept that there's a soul or an Atman. It's something that these traditions have put together from their own perspective, from other teachers and what have you, and it is something that can be refuted. The second type of self that is a subtler version of the self, this self-sufficient, substantially existent self. I won't explain it in great detail. We're going to run across it here and there, but it is essentially the analogy that's used for it is like the Jeffrey Hopkins uses this. I like this one. The head salesperson in a sales department. So you have this kind of sense of a self that has some sort of substantial independent existence, but is a part of the department that we call the aggregates, you know. So you have like your body and your mind and all the various components of that, but there's someone in charge. There's some sort of controller of all of them. We often have those thoughts, right? Oh, like my mind is a mess today, or my body is really killing me today, right? As if we're the owner of that. We're the person who's in charge. That's another view of a fabrication of self. And actually, Lama Tsongkhapa says that that is innate. That is something we are born with, unlike the first one that we acquire through wrong tenets. This one you're actually born with some feeling like there's some sort of real controller at the center of it, some lord or master, and everything else is a servant of them. And even the Buddha at times would speak that way when he was teaching to those who weren't ready for subtler teaching. But that can be refuted as well. That there is nobody there who's in that substantial position overseeing the aggregates, in charge of the aggregates. And then, of course, we have the final view of the middle way, the Prasangika Madhyamaka in particular, that says that there's no inherently existent I, which is, we haven't gotten to that yet, but the idea is that there's nothing that exists intrinsically, inherently. We use the word substantial, but we may have a different meaning there. We mean kind of on its own, self-existent, that is the I. Cannot find any of that at all. So what you see is often in the Buddha's teachings, these are presented as the three main views of a person that we want to remove. The first one being this permanent unitary kind of Atman. The second one being this self-sufficient, substantially existent self, this controller, this master. And the third being this inherently existent person. That there's something real that is the person. In the end, the person is merely designated, merely labeled. There is nothing more than that. It has no substance at all. It is lacking any sort of inherent quality. So these, again, are being spelled out here as obstacles to being able to accomplish your Dharmakaya, to achieve the state of Buddhahood. If you have the first fault, it's a view of the self as permanent and so on. Or the second fault, the view of the self as self-sufficient, substantially existent, then those will block you from moving forward. The third one is Buddhists who believe in the true existence of emptiness. This is referred to here as the Yogacharans, or the middle mind-only school, the Chittamatrans. Yogacara and Chittamatran are usually synonymous. It's just a different way of talking about that tradition. Essentially, again, they have a view. Let me take it off screen here and talk about that. I mentioned this view before once. But this is the view that the emptiness of phenomena that the Buddha taught is going to move beyond persons. This is one of the Mahayana schools. Chittamatra says that there is an emptiness of phenomena as well as person, or the selflessness of person. But what their view is that the external phenomena, everything that is appearing to you now in the external world, it lacks any ability to kind of exist in that manner that it appears. It doesn't exist as an external phenomenon. Remember, when I explained this before, you have these imprints on the mind, these bakchaks, according to this tradition, that from that imprint arises two things: the external appearance of things there and the internal subjective awareness of them. So both of those arise simultaneously. In other words, it's kind of like what happens in our dream state. Remember, I mentioned that as the best analogy, sometimes even for our version of emptiness, but in this case, it's one of the most ideal analogies for what Chittamatra was saying. That when we are in dream state, right, there's just the mind and these dream objects that are appearing, and they're arising from these imprints on our mind that cause dream appearances to arise. And we have the subjective awareness of the dream appearance and the dream appearance itself. When you wake up, both of those are seen as just part of the same seed within our own mind. That's the analogy that they frequently point to, but again, we could use it for lack of inherent existence. The Yogacharans still grasp at true existence, inherent existence. They haven't denied the fundamental flaw that we're all dealing with, which is holding things to exist on their own, intrinsically, from their own side, inherently. They will hold that even though they don't exist externally, even though the mind is part of this equation, they will hold to some level of inherent, especially the inherent existence of emptiness. Their view of emptiness, which again is the emptiness of external objects existing on their own, independent of the subjective awareness knowing them. These three, as it says there in right about the middle of the screen in that column, they fall into the extreme of nirvana in the sense of holding it as truly existent. This is again a slightly different interpretation of it, but they do have a strong desire to attain nirvana, but they're going to be thwarted in achieving non-abiding nirvana because they can't let go of the true existence or inherent existence of things. Okay, so again, it's a slightly different way of presenting this, but I think we'll get to the more detailed description when we get to the text and go through that. Now, the third and the fourth faults, which again are fear of cyclic existence and no regard for the welfare of others, these are included in this third category, those who engage in the correct method for attaining peace. Okay, so we have kind of those who are desiring peace who have wrong methods, who aren't using the right teachings, who don't have the right teachings. And then we have those who actually do have correct teachings and correct methods, who are going to attain their peace, but nonetheless, they're going to still fall into the extreme of nirvana. Okay, so this is number 3, the hearers who correctly realize subtle emptiness and who attain the peace of liberation. They fall into the extreme of nirvana primarily due to their fear of samsara. Again, that was the third fault. So I know this is confusing. This column is kind of, because you've got a lot of different things being introduced. I'll go through a brief review of it again when we get to that part of the text. Number 4 are the solitary realizers, those self-arisen, who correctly realize emptiness also. And they attain the peace of liberation or nirvana. But they fall into the extreme of nirvana due to having no concern for the welfare of others. And as I said, I would say both of them have those obstacles, but nonetheless, it's being highlighted that solitary realizers are not as driven by the fear of samsara as perhaps, they still want their own peace because they haven't yet perfected that compassion for all beings that is great compassion. So, all right, so let me take it off of this and go back to the text, and we'll be getting into that again in more detail. So we just finished that paragraph that's at the top of the page. Let's go into, whoops, that happens sometimes when I click too much. The antidotal causes that remove those faults that were identified in the first part of verse 32. Now we have the last 2 lines, E and F of verse 32. The cause of purifying these 4 is the 4 dharmas, such as the superior devotion to the Mahayana and so forth. Again, we just looked at those on the chart a short while ago. We'll see them come up again as we go through the explanation. These are the 4 causal phenomena, great devotion for the Mahayana Dharma and so forth, which act as causes for purifying the basic element of defilement. And of course, offsetting, antidoting, the opposite of those. Faith, great devotion in the Mahayana Dharma, that offsets our hatred towards the Mahayana Dharma or some neglect of the Mahayana Dharma and so on. And we'll see that coming up as we go through this. So now we have a commentary. There's a short presentation, an extensive explanation. Again, I will skip a few parts in this, but we're going to go ahead and start on the top of page 98 now. And this is, again, an introduction to those 3 categories that were in that 4th column that we just went through, okay? In brief, there are 3 kinds of beings. Those who desire samsara, or those who kind of are blind to the reality that there's a way out of samsara. They've never heard anything other than that this is the world we live in, and they embrace it for whatever it is, right? So this includes an awful lot of people, again, not just those Tritikas, but also, again, any non-Buddhists who just are simply adhering to the world and continuing to be a part of samsara with no clue that nirvana even exists. And these fall into the extreme of samsara and have no wish for freedom then. Number two, those who wish for freedom from samsara and who fall to the extreme of peace, that solitary peace that, again, if you're solely focused on your own welfare, you will, desire that and only want to achieve that. Those with no wish for the above is the third, who do not fall to the extreme of samsara or of peace. Again, they weren't on our chart, right? That's because they don't have the obstacles. They don't have the obstructions, the faults. So essentially, we have those who desire samsara, those who wish for freedom from samsara, and that's divided into two, as we saw on the chart, those who have a faulty method and those who have a correct method. And then we have the third that isn't on the chart at all because they don't have the faults. Those who wish for none of the above, for I don't want to be in samsara and I don't want to be in nirvana, in that solitary peace. I want to achieve buddhahood. They therefore are not falling to either extreme. Okay, so now we get an extensive explanation of what it means to be in these various threefold classifications of these beings. This is the first part, falling to the extreme of samsara. Those who desire samsara should be known as being of two types. That's what we saw in our chart, right? That was number one, those with attachment to psychic existence. The first is hostile toward a path to freedom and declares that freedom does not exist, thereby leading to deprecation of freedom. Even if they are aware that freedom does exist, they turn their back on it because of their great attachment. Again, whether they've even heard of freedom. I mean, I think at some level, all beings desire kind of freedom from suffering, but do they really know what they're desiring with that? I'm not sure. But nonetheless, this includes all those beings who are essentially not wanting to extricate themselves from samsara. Their attachment is too great. They're hostile to the idea of freedom. Sounds kind of strange, but again, there are different teachings out there that teach other paths, other methodology, what have you. Maybe they desire freedom, but the freedom isn't the freedom that is taught in the Buddhist path. They do not pass beyond sorrow into nirvana, Gyaltsabje says, and are known as the cutoff lineage. We're going to explain that a little bit in a moment. They desire samsara itself and make no efforts for nirvana. For the time being, these sentient beings are not at all repulsed by samsara and are incapable of developing any kind of striving for freedom. However, the teaching that these beings belong to a permanently cut off lineage is a non-literal teaching. This will be established later. So this is kind of the idea that there are those people in the world, beings in the world, who don't have a desire to remove themselves from the state of samsara. First of all, they might, as I said, they might not even see it as samsara. I mean, I'd say a lot of people in this world have this view of this being like a pleasure grove, like they're trying to get all the pleasure they can out of it. They don't really see the faults of samsara in the least. So therefore, they don't even have any compulsion to move beyond that, see nirvana as a possibility and as a more ideal option. So this is the first category, those who have that strong attachment to samsara, and they're simply stubborn in their desire to continue to be there. And that was the first little hyphen first category under number one on our chart. Then there are those who have definitely fallen to this extreme within our own Dharma. Some of these are only suitable for teachings on morality, who for the time being are not even suitable vessels for teaching on the coarse non-self person, and who have a strong attachment to the Hinayana doctrine, the fundamental vehicle. These people have resentment for the Mahayana and deprecate it by declaring it not to be the word of the Buddha. With these beings in mind, the Buddha himself said, I am not their teacher, they are not my disciples. Shariputra, they are veiled by the thick darkness of ignorance. Darker than darkness itself is their resultant endless suffering, where they are tormented ceaselessly, traveling from darkness to even greater darkness, to be enveloped by great darkness. This I have said. It sounds kind of cruel, the Buddha, to say, you're not my disciples, you're not going to achieve anything. But my understanding of why he's saying that is because they have engaged in one of the most serious faults that we can possibly do, which is to abandon the Dharma. Remember, the Buddha did teach the fundamental vehicle, the Hinayana, and the Mahayana, the universal vehicle. It's an ideal thing to never deprecate either of those. That's why what's the saving grace of the Mahayana tradition is that we have encapsulated all of the fundamental vehicle teachings. We know this from our Lam Rim studies, right? The first two levels are all taught within the fundamental vehicle. The level of the being of the least capacity, the least capable being, as Rinpoche would say, that's encompassed in the Pali Canon by virtue of teaching karma, refuge, death and impermanence, and so on, the lower states. And then we have the middle capable being. The path of that being is seeking liberation by recognizing the Four Noble Truths, by wishing to be free from suffering, developing renunciation, wanting to remove the causes of suffering, attain true cessations and through the true paths. All of that is the fundamental vehicle. That's the core of the fundamental vehicle teachings. That's the grace, the saving grace of the Lam Rim and of the way Mahayana is presenting things, is that you then go on to, on the basis of those first two levels, the third level, generating the motivation of bodhicitta, engaging in the six perfections and so on. You never abandon the holy Dharma by practicing the Lam Rim. That's one of its main advantages, one of the things that make it an ideal way to practice the Dharma. So what we're talking about here, when the Buddha says these beings who profess to be Buddhists but deprecate the Mahayana have engaged in a very serious fault. Yes, he's not their teacher, they're not his disciples for the time being. I mean, it doesn't mean that, and that was what was brought up in the end. This isn't a permanent fault. There isn't a cut-off lineage where we can say, these seeds are scorched and they will never grow, whereas everyone else still has the potential to grow into Buddhahood. They can still remove this fault of hatred for the Mahayana by, again, the antidote, which is generating faith in the Mahayana. But nonetheless, they currently have that fault. And therefore, that's why the Buddha is speaking to them in this way and speaking about them in this way, because they have engaged in that fault of deprecating the Dharma of the Buddha. Oops. Again, go back to the end of this page. So now we have falling to the extreme of peace. The general explanation begins in the Sangha's text with wishing for freedom. The specific explanation is, again, divided into two parts. Those engaged in the wrong method, which were entirely within number 2, as it's presented in that sheet there, again on our chart in that 4th column. So again, under 2, which says those engaged in wrong methods through desiring peace, they desire peace just like the other ones, but they've got the wrong methods. And we'll see they're explained again in our commentary. And then we have those engaged in the right method, which again are the hearers and the solitary realizers who have the correct understanding of emptiness, but who still have a fault because they're only going to achieve their own solitary peace. So first, those engaged in the wrong method. As we saw in the chart, these are of 3 types. The first type belongs to the numerous Tirthankara, outsider systems, who profess doctrines of permanence and non-existence. Again, this Tirthankara, I've not really run across that as much as Tirtika. It's usually translated as forder. The idea is if they want to ford across the stream to the shore of liberation, but they don't have the right methodology for achieving that. They do have a desire for nirvana, for liberation, but they lack the proper method. They profess doctrines of permanence and non-existence. They are outside our own Dharma, both by way of view and practice. Okay? So again, they say permanence and non-existence, but the permanence of a solitary or unitary self, this Atman idea, and then of course non-existence. I guess because they're essentially they're propounding a non-existence of the emptiness that is taught in the higher tradition. I'm not sure why non-existence is included in there. They give an example of this. They include the hedonist Charvakas, the wandering Parivraka Rajaka, and the naked Negrantha, which are the Jains. The Jains are still around. You'll see them in India. People who don't wear clothes, who are essentially engaged in a lot of ascetic type of practices. Some of these even deny the existence of a high status of rebirth in past and future lives, and some, like the Mimamsaka, while accepting high status, deny the existence of freedom. So you have a variety of these Tirtika systems that kind of teach a number of things, but most of them do tend to fall in and around the Vedic traditions that are teaching this view of a self. So they're holding to a view of a self. Again, that's the fault that they primarily possess, just like the next ones that we're going to see, that keep them from having a proper method because they haven't learned or developed a view of the no self that is taught in the Prasangika Madhyamaka, the consequence middle way school, that is the only way out, according to the teachings of the Buddha. The second type, which was the second little hyphenated group on our chart, while following practices similar to the outsiders, have faith in our Dharma. However, they hold to a wrong understanding of emptiness. Who are they? It is like this. They have no faith in the ultimate. Like the philosophy asserted by the other schools, they believe in a substantially existing person whose existence is not imputed at all on the collection or the continuum of the aggregates. This is the thing about that kind of sense of a controller, that there's some imputational nature to it. It's not as imputational as Prasangika Madhyamaka, but it nonetheless has some sort of imputational existence. There's a sense of an I here that, again, is the controller, the head salesperson over the entire sales department of the aggregates. So this group includes some sections of the Buddhist Vatsiputriya who hold to a tenet of a self of persons. Again, they hold to the existence of that. They do not deny that. They are similar to those within our own Dharma. So again, their view of selflessness is solely to deny that permanent unitary independent self, that Atman. They don't go further to deny this. They actually hold to that. And of course, in the highest school, Prasangika Madhyamaka, that's still a coarse view of a self of person. The coarsest view is, of course, this Atman that is denied. The lesser coarse one, the one that is also a part of our realization because we have that innate view, is to deny this self-sufficient, substantially existent person that we're talking about here. So it says they are similar to those within our own Dharma mentioned above, insofar as they both assert the self of persons. However, those mentioned above make no effort to attain freedom, right? And that was in that first delineation. And they resent the Mahayana Dharma. While this latter type strive for freedom, and some do not deprecate the Mahayana Dharma. Among the Vatsiputriya, there are those who do and those who do not deprecate the Mahayana scriptures. So if they were deprecating it, then they would have two faults, I guess. Again, the self that they're adhering to and not denying, and then also the deprecation of the Mahayana. And I would say probably a lot of people have more than one fault. These are not just solely the people, like separate categories for individual. And then it says the Kashmiri Vibhashika, etc., may be similarly divided. And I'm not going to get into all of these explanations of these things because I don't know if it's as relevant to what we're trying to accomplish in this text. Applying this to scripture, the Buddha said, no, actually, I'm going to skip this. We're getting the scripture stuff. I'm going to skip that in the next paragraph. Let's go to the third type of person. And this is the third little hyphen on our chart under that second, those engaged in wrong method through desiring peace. The third type of person, Gyaltsab says, while not understanding the ultimate way that phenomena exist, nevertheless think that they do, and conceitedly holds a view of emptiness, which sees emptiness as truly existing. Whatever view on emptiness they may have, their gateway to freedom will consist of that view on emptiness. And of course, that gateway is faulty. If the gateway or method to attain the freedom of nirvana is the wisdom of realizing emptiness, then to hold that emptiness as truly existing is explained as being a temporarily incurable view. They can eventually see the lack of inherent existence of that emptiness and of all other things that they're adhering to. But nonetheless, at the moment, they are still adhering to it to be inherently existent. So again, it says here, it is clear that this refers to the Yogacara school, the mind only, the Chittamatrans, who assert an emptiness that is the lack of any difference in substance between the apprehending consciousness, the subjective awareness, and the apprehended object. This is their ultimate reality. Again, remember when I last brought this up, it was in reference to the Sutra Unraveling the Thought that we saw way back in the beginning. That's what's taught as the view of emptiness there. And that was in the third wheel turning where the Buddha said, I'm going to give a sort of intermediate view of emptiness to help you who aren't ready for the final view of emptiness I taught in the second wheel turning in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. But this is not the final view. And he goes on to say they are also accept that emptiness truly exists in the sense of existing by way of its own characteristics, from its own side, substantially, intrinsically, and so on. This is the opinion of the omniscient J. Rinpoche. Otherwise, it would follow that they do not fit in any of these three categories, which the commentary lists later. So again, they fit here because they have a desire for nirvana, whether it be non-abiding nirvana or solitary peace, but they have an obstacle because they're still adhering to true existence, inherent existence. Okay, so let me see. Am I going to skip this? Yeah, I'm going to skip these next few paragraphs because, again, it just is further kind of verbiage on some of this, and I don't know that really adds much more and maybe takes us into territory that will consume time. So let's go to this paragraph that's at the top of the page here. Being engaged in the wrong method here refers to those tenets that hold to the true existence of emptiness. This is in opposition to the ultimate view of emptiness, the final view, even though other meditations and practices may be followed perfectly. I mean, they do, Chitamatrans, again, Yogacaras, are part of the Mahayana path. They're doing everything they need to achieve Buddhahood. They may have abandoned the other obstacles, right? They have a love for the Mahayana and a devotion and faith in it. They have no attachment to their own peace or to, the samsara, but nonetheless, and they have this, great cherishing of others. They don't have the correct view. They have a wrong method. So it says here, however, to say that the Chittamatra view is an obstacle to attaining freedom is a hugely distorted view, revealing an ignorance of the paths and stages. What this is getting at is that even though the Chittamatra emptiness is not the final view, it still is a stepping stone. For many people, many individuals need this. They say the Buddha taught this particularly, again, for people who have strong attachment to the external world. Maybe we need those teachings, many of us, who really put a lot of energy and time into these external objects. If we get the view that these external objects don't really exist in reality as external objects, it's like a dream. They're just a karmic arising. There's no real taste of ice cream. There's no real, delightful music. There's no whatever of these things. Well, then we have an ability to divorce ourselves from those objects through lessening our attachment. Then it says there, to apply this to scripture, the sutra requested by Kashyapa says, Kashyapa, to have views on the person the size of Meru is tolerable, but with conceit to have views on emptiness is not. So he's kind of getting at the fact that if they do have kind of this prideful mind that really adheres to this false view of emptiness as intrinsically existent, well, then they're going to have problems. It says there, although just the innate clinging to a self of persons is still present, they do not assert it to be the ultimate view, nor is the self of persons asserted to be the ultimate emptiness. For these schools, actually Svatantrika Madhyamaka, the autonomy middle way school and lower, all those lower tenet systems adhere to liberation being able to be achieved through denying, contradicting the self-sufficient, substantially existent self of persons. So that innate sort of view of persons that we have is all that needs to be denied to achieve nirvana for oneself alone. In the Mahayana schools, before we get to Prasangika Madhyamaka, they go on to teach a view of emptiness that needs to be realized in order to achieve Buddhahood. But nonetheless, Prasangika Madhyamaka says, well, you're all wrong in the sense that even though, yes, we will deny that coarser view of a self of persons, we have to also deny the inherently existent self of persons, and we have to deny the inherent existence of all phenomena. So again, even though Chittamatra will say that you do abandon that view of a self of persons to achieve nirvana, the self of persons isn't the ultimate emptiness. For them, the ultimate emptiness is, again, this lack of substantial difference between the object arising that is apprehended and the apprehending subjective awareness. Let's continue. Sorry, more explanation in here as we go through this. That second line at the end, however, they do assert emptiness, that is, the lack of any difference in substantiality between apprehender and apprehended, as being the ultimate reality. And this deposits a mentally constructed view on top of the innate view, which becomes difficult to eradicate. So again, he does say, even though he said, don't deprecate it as like not part of the path of liberation, he does say, though, that if you adhere to this view of emptiness really strongly, and especially you adhere to it as being inherently existent, that emptiness, you're continuing to reify things that is contrary to how you actually achieve non-abiding nirvana. So those yogacharans, those mind-only practitioners, they have kind of another obstacle. They're able to realize something that helps them on their path, but they might in the process deny the ultimate view of emptiness and therefore don't have the right method, again, to fully attain liberation or enlightenment, certainly, which is their main goal. So again, this is just speaking to the fact that those who have these different tenet systems in Buddhism will have obstacles to achieving liberation, nirvana, by way of them having the wrong method. They haven't actually gotten their teachings to the correct place so that they can actually do that work fully. I'm skipping one part of this. I'm going to skip this right to the next outline. And the next outline is getting us into the topic that is those engaged in the right method. This is that third delineation that's in bold on our chart. It doesn't have a number on it because it's not one of the four beings in terms of classifications. There's two within this, numbers 3 and 4. These are those who engage in the correct method for attaining peace, those who have the right method. So Gyaltsab says here, those who fall to the extreme of peace and are engaged in the right method are also of two types. There are those who enter the perfect way and are in accord with the vehicle of the hearers, the Shravakas. They understand the subtle emptiness that is the no self of persons and phenomena and attain the direct realization of their path of seeing, again on the fundamental vehicle. The second type is the solitary realizer whose way of realizing emptiness is similar. They also realize the no self, no inherently existent self of persons or phenomena, and attain the path of seeing, the initial direct realization of emptiness. So again, this is the unique view too of the Sangha Madhyamaka. As I said just a short while ago, all those other schools hold that you can achieve liberation, such as what a hearer and a solitary realizer are trying to achieve, through realizing a coarser view of the selflessness of persons. But according to Prasangika Madhyamaka, if you're going to achieve nirvana for yourself alone or buddhahood, both of those results that are definite goodness, you have to realize the emptiness of inherent existence. There's no other way out, as there's one exit door. And that's the only one that will get you to your own nirvana as well as non-abiding nirvana buddhahood. So again, these are those who have found the right method, but they don't yet have what it takes to get to buddhahood because they still have these two faults. So as it says here, this also teaches that hearers and solitary realizers both realize the two kinds of subtle emptiness. Again, emptiness of self, persons, emptiness of self of phenomena. Because engaging in the wrong method through wrong views, where the reality of existence is not realized and both phenomena and emptiness are held to be truly existent, was taught in the previous section, right? This is where these beings fall, because they have the right method. Hallelujah, they found the right way out, but they don't yet have what it takes to achieve the Dharmakaya. They still have faults. Also, right after it says 111 there, also if right method and wrong method were differentiated by method as opposed to wisdom, and which refers to those practices that lead to enlightenment together with the generation of the Mahayana mind, the basis of those practices, then it would have been correct to include hearers and solitary realizers in those engaged in the wrong method. In other words, they have the wrong method for attaining Buddhahood in terms of not having the right motivation. But we're mainly talking about wisdom being the discriminating feature here. That doesn't allow, or that, that's the feature that allows them to be in this category of having the right method. Because they have, I'm getting into using the word method and wisdom. Let's you have this idea again of, let me take it off screen while I'm talking about this so I can be sure to delineate this correctly. When we talk about hearers and solitary realizers, they have the correct wisdom, right? Because they can achieve these that we're talking about, they can achieve their goal of liberation. In terms of the kind of compassion side of the path, which we often call method, that's why we get confused. And sometimes when I start talking, I want to make sure that I'm not confusing others. When we talk about the method side of the path, they only have renunciation and the desire for self-liberation. They don't have bodhicitta and the mind desiring Buddhahood. In a way, we could say they have the wrong method then to attain Buddhahood, right? Because they don't have the full method path that will allow them to achieve the Dharmakaya. But here we're only delineating this in terms of wisdom. They have the correct wisdom, and we're saying they still have that fault then of not having the correct method. That's why we can include them in this category that says they have the right method, the correct method, because it's not method in that regard. They have the correct method or means to attain liberation. They don't have the correct method to attain Buddhahood. That makes sense? They make sense out of it? I know we're using these words kind of in dual meaning. When we say correct method on here, we mean that they have the correct wisdom that will allow them to attain their goal, whereas they are differentiated from the ones we discussed who didn't have the right method, right? They had a faulty method. When we talk about the method side of the path, yes, they do lack that. They don't have bodhicitta. They don't have the ability to become a Buddha on the basis of their realizations because they don't have that fully intact. They have not developed the Mahayana mind of bodhicitta. As it says there, the basis of those practices is the generation of bodhicitta, the Mahayana mind. Then it would have been correct to include them in those engaged in the wrong method. But here, therefore, whether the attainment is freedom or omniscience, self-liberation or non-abiding nirvana, from the perspective of the view of the ultimate method can be none other than the realization of subtle emptiness. So when we say correct method or incorrect method, that's what we're talking about. Do you have the correct view of ultimate emptiness, the final emptiness the Buddha taught, or do you have a faulty view of emptiness? And the final sentence there, although this realization is found in hearer and solitary realizer arias, there's no certainty that it is found throughout the hearer and solitary realizer lineage. Why? Because again, we can have hearers and solitary realizers who are in those categories above, who don't have the right method. They haven't found the subtle view of emptiness. They might be working with teachings that are faulty in that regard and not leading you to the final result. Okay, finally, the ones that aren't on our chart. Why? Because they lack all four faults, right? They don't have the fault of lacking faith in the Mahayana, having a hatred or disdain to the Mahayana. They don't have the fault of a view of a self. They don't have the fault of a fear of psychic existence that is driving them to, attain their own nirvana, nor do they have the lack of concern for other sentient beings. As it says here, through the power of karma and mental afflictions, one is born in samsara. That's the first extreme. By putting a stop to birth in samsara, one attains nirvana, the second extreme. To have no desire for either of these is to dwell perfectly within the Mahayana. This is why they say bodhisattvas are free of these two extremes. They actually say one of the reasons for bodhisattvas generating refuge is fear of the two extremes. Their refuge is grounded in, I don't want to end up in samsara with all the suffering there because I've developed my renunciation and all of that. But I don't want to go to solitary peace, check out of psychic existence and leave all my kind mother sentient beings behind. I fear that enticement of solitary peace, just like I fear samsara. Then he goes on to say, Gyaltsab J says, of these, there are special and ordinary disciples. The latter would include the Yogacara, while the former are the most intelligent of beings who practice to perfection the philosophies and meditations of the Mahayana. In other words, we can say that Yogacaras, again, don't dwell in those two extremes, right? If they're Mahayana practitioners and within the Chittamatrin school. It is kind of weird. When you talk about the tenet systems, you can have all three followers, hearers, solitary realizers, and bodhisattvas in any of those schools. But we mainly talk about Chittamatrin in the presentation of it being a Mahayana tenet system and therefore applicable to bodhisattvas. But if you have a bodhisattva who's practicing Yogacara, they have this lack of wanting to be in either extreme. They have abandoned that, but they don't have the right method, again, as we saw. Continuing, the Altsukje says, unlike those of great desire, they enter a path in which samsara and nirvana are equalized. They are of a pure attitude, with a mind reliant upon non-abiding nirvana, and of pure conduct, with conduct reliant upon samsara devoid of mental affliction, in which they take birth through the force of prayer and compassion. Again, they have the same practices as those in the Madhyamika, the middle way. They dwell in compassion and a firm resolve that wishes all sentient beings to be free of suffering, together with the thought, I will free them. He says, this is the foundation and the pure root of the Mahayana mind. And essentially, we are talking about the special ones, the ones that we are delineating, as the main target here, being the great Madhyamikas, those who practice to perfection the path that negates the two extremes of samsara and peace. Not just the mind-only practitioners who have that mind that wishes to abandon both extremes, but those who have the correct method, those who actually know the way out through having generated great faith, not just in the Mahayana, but in the view of no self as taught in the Madhyamika and the middle way. Okay, we're getting there. We're almost done with this section. So now we have this threefold classification. Again, this is, anytime it's in bold, it's lines from a Sangha's commentary, so it's hard to make sense out of them. It's just kind of giving an idea of where that is being taught in a Sangha's commentary that Gyaltsep is commenting on, which again, we're not studying a Sangha's commentary. So we see that this is again being taught in this section. We go down to the very bottom of the page where it says teaching. Oops, how did they do that? Where am I at? Okay. And we're at the bottom of page 101. It says this begins from the line, apart from those sentient beings dwelling perfectly within the Mahayana, perceiving the obstructions to be without nature, those of great desire, the outsiders, the hearers, and the solitary realizers. These four kinds of sentient beings dwell within the obstructions that prevent the realization and actualization of the Tathagata-based element. So this highlighted section from Asanga says, okay, first, those who have great desire, who again are falling into the category of not wanting to go to nirvana, who have some disdain towards the Mahayana and so on. The outsiders, the hearers and the solitary realizers, these these four kinds of sentient beings have the obstructions. Again, we delineated them when we went through earlier what obstructions they were with. I don't need to review that again, but they still have obstacles to activating their basic element, their Buddha nature, and achieving Buddhahood, going on to attain the Dharmakaya. So then he says, this refers to dwelling in the obstructions that prevent the realization of emptiness by nature, together with the complete method side, and for the time being, obscure its realization. This is not a general teaching that the hearers and solitary realizers do not realize emptiness, but it refers to the fact that their meditations are not characterized by the treasury of space samadhi, the meditative concentration treasury of space, as explained further on. It's kind of saying that they can still have within this the fault that is alleviated by having this deep meditative state of samadhi stabilization that was our third cause. Hard to talk about all of these sets of four that we're dealing with here, the four different main possessors of these obstacles, the four obstacles, the four causes that remove those obstacles. Let's carry on then with what is said in this explanation of this that will go into a little more detail. We're getting towards the end of this section. What are these four? The Bodhisattvas meditate on, first, devotion to the Mahayana Dharma as an antidote for hatred and anger toward the Mahayana Dharma, which is the obstruction of those with strong desire. That again was the first of the four that was just delineated on the bottom of that previous page. Two, the Bodhisattvas meditate on the perfection of wisdom, the perfect view of selflessness, as an antidote for the views on self, which is the obstruction of the Tirthankara outsiders. Three, the Bodhisattvas meditate on the treasury of space samadhi, it's very deep meditative concentration and so forth, as an antidote to seeing samsara as suffering and to abandoning other, and that's the third one, ending right there. Again, this is correlated to primarily the hearers who are afraid of samsara, who think they need to gain liberation, nirvana to get out of that, whereas the Bodhisattvas recognize that they can remove their suffering to a great degree by trusting in this samadhi as a womb. Remember, this was compared to the womb of the mother. And then fourth, to abandoning other sentient beings, which is the obstruction of those of the hearer doctrine who are frightened by the sufferings of samsara. Oh, I'm sorry, this was included in that. I didn't, this all should have been put together, okay. So it says here, from the bodhisattvas meditate on the treasury of space, da, 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 da. It goes all the way through this, those of the hearer doctrine who are frightened by the sufferings of samsara. Said there to abandon sentient beings. That's why, again, I mentioned earlier that we do have both of those faults kind of within the hearer and the solitary realizer lineage. You know, they don't have the view of holding others as important and dear in the way that the Mahayanists do. And they also, again, have some fear of samsara. Okay, so then number four, sorry. So that was all number three, that entire sentence. Number four, the bodhisattvas meditate upon great compassion as an antidote to the obstructions of the solitary realizers who pay no regard to the welfare of others and turn their backs on sentient beings. So they also abandon sentient beings. But again, in this presentation, they're being identified as those who have lesser regard for the welfare of other beings. Again, I don't know whether these things are absolute. I would think you'd have beings that would overlap in this regard. And it says, you know, they don't take on the promise or the responsibility that promises, I will free sentient beings. They don't have, again, that great compassion. Here, each obstruction is linked with its respective antidote. So again, it's kind of the third or fourth time we've gone through that and kind of correlated these things. So hopefully you're getting an appreciation for how those four causes remove the four obstacles, and then the beings who tend to fall in the categories who possess those obstacles. And it makes sense how they are doing that, right? You know, they're definitely targeting that state of mind that is antithetical to them proceeding on the Mahayana path to achieving the Dharmakaya. The summary. This begins from the line, the bodhisattvas meditate on these four. To summarize, great devotion toward the causal and resultant Mahayana Dharma as a prerequisite, followed by meditation on great compassion leading to the generation of the mind of supreme enlightenment, and meditation on the exclusively Mahayana meditative concentration focused on the union of calm abiding and special insight. That covers, again, the samadhi as well as the view of self that we are overcoming with special insight into emptiness. This is the complete body of antidotes. Okay, so the last little bit of this, this last section. Armed with these four causes that bring about the four pure perfections that we're going to see in the next section on results, such as that of purity, that's the first of the four perfections in that section on result, the third presentation. One will become a son of the Dharma king or a child of the Dharma king in the lineage of the Tathagatas from the first level onwards. Again, bodhisattva from the first level onwards, meaning from the first ground when they achieve their initial direct realization of emptiness. How is that accomplished? We have the final verse in this section. Verse 33 says from Maitreya, those who have the seed of devotion to the Mahayana Dharma, whose mother is the wisdom that gives birth to a Buddha's truth body, who abide in the womb of blissful concentration and whose nurse is compassion, are the heirs to succeed the subduer. The heirs of the bodhisattvas, the children of the heirs of the Buddhas, the children of the Buddhas, the bodhisattvas. So, yet another explanation correlating it to the analogies. Devotion for the causal and resultant Mahayana, or faith in the Mahayana, is like a seed that gives birth to a son of a Chakravartin emperor. Wisdom, realizing emptiness and adorned by the vast practices from the method side, is like a mother that creates the dharmas of the Buddha. In keeping with the expression, mother is wisdom, father is method, the wisdom realizing emptiness is a cause common to the enlightenments of all three vehicles, and is therefore mother. Method is an exclusive cause, and is therefore designated father. So that's when we talk about method and wisdom being these two branches, two wings that allow you to attain Buddhahood. Dwelling in the womb, let me explain that a little bit more before we go on. When it says method is an exclusive cause and is therefore designated father, this is based on they say in traditional India, the mother could be whoever, but the father would, whatever their caste was, would dictate the caste of the child. So the mother was kind of a common receptacle for whatever result was going to be born, just like the womb of emptiness is the same. I'm sorry, that womb of emptiness, the mother of emptiness, of the wisdom realizing emptiness, is the same mother for the resultant state of a hero path, of one's own arhatship, and that the arhatship of a solitary realizer, as well as the full buddhahood of a bodhisattva. Okay, so there's a final result that is dictated by the method side, by that side that is the father, whereas the mother is common to all three of them. The mother is the wisdom realizing emptiness. Again, that allows you to achieve all three of those results. I hope I explained that clearly enough. So then it says, dwelling in the womb of the bliss of meditative absorption. This is the third one, again, which is compared to a womb. As summarized here by the treasury of space samadhi, these beings are, whoops, sorry, go back up, well cared for by the nurse of compassion, which is important at the beginning, middle, and end, and will become children born after the great subduer. So that was the third, the meditative stabilization, that is the womb, which is combined with that special insight to achieve Buddhahood. And then fourthly, the great compassion, which is like the nurse. Chandrakirti, in his text, Madhyamakavatar, that we studied in the master's program, makes an homage to compassion at the beginning, where he talks about its importance in the beginning, middle, and end. And I won't go into all of that, but just know that this is a way of talking about how great compassion is, like, again, what moistens and develops the mind through the whole process of attaining Buddhahood. Final paragraph for tonight. Of the three kinds of faith in the causal and resultant phenomena of the Mahayana, namely joyful faith, sometimes called clear faith, aspirational faith, and belief, or faith of belief, conviction, faith of conviction, convinced faith, the third type sometimes. Devotion, as it is taught here, is that first antidote, that first cause, refers to the third kind of faith, belief or trust or confidence. And it's taught here to emphasize that faith is at the root of every Dharma. Faith has the function of being the basis for aspiration. And with great compassion as a cause, it leads to the intention to work for complete enlightenment. This, in turn, leads to the intention to work for the causes of becoming a Buddha. Gradually, by the practice of meditative stabilization focused on the union of calm abiding and special insight, the above obstructions will be destroyed. So again, I was going to do a little more presentation on faith, but I would assume many of you have studied in minds and mental factors. It goes into faith as one of our 11 virtuous mental factors. And faith, that does have those three types. A clear faith that very clearly sees the qualities of what it is we are trying to achieve, the aspirational faith that desires to move in that direction, and the convinced faith, or faith of belief, that gains even deeper conviction that causes you to move forward to attain those results. So we're primarily talking about that here in regard to the faith in the Mahayana. Rather than take questions, I really do want people to go ahead and discuss a little bit. And then if you have a question right now on what I talked about, we'll come back in at least 5 or so minutes before. But I want to give you about 20 minutes to discuss the questions. And I'm not sure what people are doing online with this, but you're welcome to do either these two questions that were sent out in the homework for this week, which were covered last time. If you want to go back and revisit what was discussed in terms of nature, the first presentation, and then of course the verse that we meditated on tonight to begin with, and verse 28 that explained that a little bit, yeah, you're welcome to do that. If you want to discuss what we looked at tonight, that's the third question, cause, and it goes into all of the various things that we discussed. The fourth question I just put on there for good measure. We didn't even get to that third topic, which I didn't think we would, but nonetheless, I'm kind of trying to get a little bit ahead and maybe even give you a preview of what's coming in the future. So again, decide whatever it is that you would like to discuss, whoever's leading the group online, as well as leading here in the Thampa. And we've got 20 minutes from now. So at 8:55 here in Santa Fe, 20 minutes, we'll reconvene. So, all right, happy discussing. Good. Let's go ahead and reconvene and see if there are any questions from the discussion. Maybe I'll just check in with the folks online. Did you discuss the third question then, what we covered tonight? Okay. That may be what we do going forward. I don't know. I've been putting those there because Jane had originally suggested that we do that, and she hasn't been coming. So, so maybe we just go to discussing what was covered that night, and I'll stop repeating those questions on that, because otherwise, yeah. So, any questions from tonight? Yeah, Stephen. It's Lama Tsongkhapa, yes. Yeah. So just let me tell those at home. On page 99, Stephen asks if J Rinpoche, where it mentions that, is that Lama Tsongkhapa? And I meant to say that when we went through, yes, that is Lama Tsongkhapa. Was it 99? Yeah, omniscient J Rinpoche. Uh-huh. Oh, okay. Okay. So Stephen's question had to do with my comment that I made when we were going through things on page 101 that had to do with when I was talking about these yogacharans, these mind-only practitioners, I was making it almost sound like they're bodhisattvas. In this example and what they're talking about, they are bodhisattvas because they have abandoned both extremes and they are practicing the bodhisattva path, but using Chittamatran tenets. My comment had to do with the fact that we have 4 tenet systems. We have Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamaka. And most of you have studied these or heard these at least in teachings from here at the center or from His Holiness, what have you. All 4 of those, we say the first 2 are Hinayana, fundamental vehicle. The last 2 are Mahayana, but that's only in terms of the tenet systems. There are within each of those 4 all 3 vehicles. So you could have a person of Vaibhashika tenets who is a hearer practitioner, a person of Vaibhashika tenets who is a solitary realizer practitioner, a person of Vaibhashika tenets who is a Mahayanist, who is a bodhisattva. Because to become a bodhisattva just takes the motivation of bodhicitta. You could still follow Hinayana tenets or a fundamental vehicle tenets. So all 4 tenet systems teach all 3 vehicles. Now, in the 2 that we call Hinayana or fundamental vehicle tenet systems, Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, the bodhisattva path is not as accentuated. And it's not taught in quite the same way that it is within the Mahayana. So the emphasis on the bodhisattva path in the Mahayana tenet systems, Chittamatra and Madhyamaka, is greater. But nonetheless, according to the teachings of Madhyamika, especially consequence Prasangika Madhyamika, all practitioners of these 3 vehicles have to get the tenets of Madhyamika in order to achieve the result. So at some point, one would have to transcend being a follower of Vaibhashika or Sautrantika or Chittamatra, would have to get to the Madhyamaka to actually achieve the result. But nonetheless, you can still have practitioners of those 3 paths of solitary realizer, hearer, and bodhisattva paths. Does that make sense? Bodhicitta it's included within the Hinayana tenet. Yeah, I mean, it's just bodhicitta would only be cultivated by those of the bodhisattva lineage who are wanting to become a Buddha, even though they're within the Vaibhashika or Sautrantika tenets. Again, how we delineate these as the first 2 tenets as being Hinayana or fundamental vehicle, and the last 2 as being Mahayana, is primarily on the types of teachings that they embrace. The 2 here that are the lower systems, Vaibhashika and Sautrantika, do not teach a selflessness of phenomena in the way that it is taught within the Mahayana. So they mainly teach a selflessness of persons. Again, the 2 that we talked about tonight, the course is self of persons, which is that permanent, unitary, independent self, the Atman, and then the self-sufficient, substantially existent person. That's what's primarily taught within them. So again, we have this kind of, that's the main delineation between Hinayana and Mahayana when we talk about the tenet systems, though there are a few other things that are included. But you can have bodhicitta and be a practitioner of any of those four tenet systems. Can you achieve Buddhahood through your bodhicitta with any of the four? Not according to Prasangika Madhyamaka. Mhm. Right. Yeah. So Stephen is just saying that yes, for the view of the Prasangika Madhyamaka, the consequence middle way school, the highest of the tenet systems, according to the Tibetans, they would say anyone who is an Arya, a superior being who has realized emptiness, achieved the path of seeing, as we discussed briefly earlier tonight, they have to have realized the emptiness that is taught by Prasangika Madhyamaka, the lack of inherent existence of the person and all phenomena. Did you have any other questions? Okay, that was good. Any other questions online or in the compa?
Gotta go.
Time?
Yeah.
Yeah, we should probably wrap up. But do you want to, did you have one, Kodo, that you'd like to ask? No, okay. And let's go ahead and wrap up for tonight, I think. So again, I was happy I made it through this second presentation. You do
Yay.
have the chart that you can begin to look at, and if you want to move forward in the text a little bit. This third presentation, I went back to the last time I taught it. I think it took me 3 or 4 classes to get through it. I'm going to try to do it in 1 or 2, just simply because I'm going to skip over some parts to some degree, and I may do what I did for an earlier section where I summarize what's taught on a little sheet and give that to you. Because there's some sections in here, and there's so many different sets of 4. And this one coming up, we just talked about some sets of 4 causes and so on with the 4 obstacles. Well, there are 4 results that correspond to those, but then there are these other sets of 4, and it just becomes very confusing very quickly. So I'm just wanting to simplify things as much as possible and mainly teach what is on the charts. So if you look at the chart for result number 3, it's page 3 of the set of charts. That would be useful just to kind of take a look at it and see where your questions are, just in terms of the way that it's presented. And I'll explain that the presentation next week. Let's do the prayers that are in the what's on the screen. I'm going to have to tab to another part for this. There we go. All right. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. And for His Holiness, the wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world. To the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. And then the prayer for Rinpoche's swift return. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings, through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable Venerable Guru, to you I make request. Oops, sorry. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and from other living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss. Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the 3 jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Let's dedicate lastly for any beings that we're holding in our hearts, those whose situation moves us at this time, so they may be free of their suffering and find true peace and happiness, all the causes that will lead to them. And may this be so for all beings who what we've accomplished here tonight. Thank you all for hanging in there tonight. And the topics do get a little more complex as we get into this, but hang in there and keep doing what you're doing. And I hope I can explain things adequately to help you in your study. So thanks so much. Bye-bye.